I also want to open it up to the people who are here this morning, and Penny's coming to take the microphone because I'm sure that in what you've heard, you've been stimulated perhaps to make some observations or ask some questions. So,
Philip asked about the impact of Sorry Day. Marjorie Seaford asked about what's behind the problem of alcohol abuse. She suggested that it's perhaps that men don't have a role, and for your input onto that question. And Jennifer asked about what can the general public do to pressure the governments on the issue of alcohol abuse?
Perhaps if I start just to respond to the first one, might go across the panel to get a response. But I think that there is still a whole political process open with really how things unfold after the sorry statement. I think that symbolic reparation is important, and it was an important symbolic statement, but it needs to be backed up by the programs, the kind of attention, I think the discipline to be based on evidence, and as far as the political process can allow it, for there to be a joint approach between the parties federally and between the state and territory governments and the federal government. And I think there's some will behind that, but it seems to me that that's really the rollout of what makes a situation in the future different to what it's been in the past. But my own personal view is that we have a fairly high level of often unidentified racism in Australian society, which can quickly have low expectations for Aboriginal people and seemingly explain things which would otherwise be intolerable as being somehow acceptable when they occur in the Aboriginal community.
I think that's right. There are two separate standards. If you're disabled in an accident, you know, there are laws and there are, you know, traditions as to how such a person would be treated. You know, there would certainly it's not good enough still, but and the same goes for, say, war veterans. You know, so there are systems in place. I mean, we have laws about ramps for new buildings, and there are services, and there's an understanding that I think in general that, you know, people ought to be able to live to the best of their ability, and that if there are practical ways in which people can be assisted to do that, then those services ought to be provided. But as I say, it's certainly not good enough. But, you know, in relation to the disablement that removal of children from their families has caused in the Aboriginal community, there's a view that there ought to be no response to that at all. You know, get on with it. That's the attitude. Well, you know, you can see the inherent racism.
And what about the question raised about the role that Aboriginal men perhaps don't have anymore in some parts of Australia?
Well, that's, you know, plainly and simply the result of the introduction of welfare, unemployment benefits, CDP into these communities about 25, 30 years ago. So whereas in many of those communities you had sawmills, bakeries, butcheries, people working, you'll remember it, people working as mechanics, the Aboriginal men had trades, skills. In a remote outstation in Arnhem Land, I've met a man who was a helicopter engineer. Well, now we don't have that because of the CDP, the Community Development Employment Program, which is a work for the dole scheme. So people have had what they call sit-down money for 25 years, and now we have, you know, 2 generations of people who've been out of the workforce, whereas prior to that, there were jobs, there were economic projects in communities, cattle, timber, and so on. People need to be in the economy.
Clare, perhaps I could just reframe a little bit the last question for you, just that whole question of what sort of influence matters. Are there processes we yet don't have in the political process that we really need to develop so we can build a bipartisanship, or we can actually have this responsiveness to what I think is most Australian people's urgency to see growth and improvement in some of the things we're talking about.
What I've got to say now, Philip, is that we've painted a very dysfunctional picture of Aboriginal community. I mean, I'm specifically talking about the Northern Territory. And yes, in many cases, that is what is happening. There are communities that struggle. They'll have times when, you know, the community works well, and then it will fall apart. But can I say that there are some communities right around Australia that work wonderfully. You've got extraordinary people in those communities. They work harder than we would dream of. They're involved in so many aspects of the community. They hold down full-time jobs. They care for their kids well. And there are Aboriginal people who are contributing, and I'm in awe of them because I just know what they do in their communities. So it's one of the things that drove me crazy about the intervention was that discussions in Australia were all about totally dysfunctional, kind of one-dimensional Aboriginal people, and it is not the case. We have Aboriginal communities that work well, we have ones that are really struggling, but it is not one picture for the scene of Aboriginal Australia. And Aboriginal people came to me and said, can't you stop this discussion that's going on around Australia about we're all drunks, we all beat our kids, and we're all hopeless. That is not the case. You know, I have worked, they'd say, I have worked all my life, I've contributed, and I'm getting cast as this kind of, you know, almost not contributing person, dysfunctional, and said to me, stop it. And I said, I can't. You know, this discussion has got away. And I felt so bad for those people who just wanted to have it recognised that Aboriginal Australians are contributing, and many are putting in more than we would dream of. So while I'm not saying it's a terrific picture overall, I'm saying you can find some extraordinary people and communities that function well, where every day most of the people are going to work, and they do contribute. The issue of alcohol and what governments are doing, I think governments are making moves in many parts of Australia. I'm proud of what we've done in the Territory. We started in 2001 to try and control alcohol consumption, but we knew we had to do it with the community. And can I say that the work I did in Alice Springs, and I felt that Alice Springs was a really kind of critical area for alcohol consumption and the damage it was doing, the hardest people to get on board were the Aboriginal community. I mean, the white community was a bit grumpy about, you know, really limiting what could be bought, and said it would damage tourism, but came on board quite quickly. The Aboriginal community was harder. So it has taken time, we have got results. And, but it's not something in what was reflected in the intervention that somehow or other there was a magic bullet. There was some kind of quick answer. It is not the case. You know, changing health outcomes takes time. It takes time in the non-Aboriginal community, and it takes time in the Aboriginal community. And I'm proud of the fact in the Territory, in the first 4 years of this century, Aboriginal women's life expectancy increased 3 years. 3 years, which is very significant. Aboriginal baby mortality has halved, morbidity has increased, has also shown very positive signs. So we're getting factors right across the board. Aboriginal retention at school is increasing. We've got a long way to go, but the start was made, and it's against a bleak picture, but you're not going to get a turnaround. Maybe Marcia would disagree with me, but you're not going to get a turnaround in a couple of years or in 6 months. The idea of the intervention was to go into a community and stabilise, to normalise and exit, like a military operation in 6 months. It wasn't going to happen.
Okay, some more questions. Thank you. Perhaps, Philip, we might take David's question about whether the church has a plan. Christine asked about women's groups, and that sounds a question for both our two women on the panel, and then Robbie, a specific question for Marcia. So would you like to start?
Yeah, I think I said at the time of the intervention that the principles I would think apply are that the highest degree of participation by Aboriginal people in any issue that affects their life is probably going to be the predictor of success. And I think we've heard today that that issue is not entirely simple, but I still would hold to that I think as members of the public, as a church which is wanting to engage in this broad public space of discussion, we should be continually looking for the highest engagement of Aboriginal people, the people who are concerned. We should honour the aspirations of people for the things that they want in their life, and we should hold all of the instruments of our society accountable for the resources that are deployed and the outcomes that are had. I think that something like that as a kind of a church stance, to me, means that we can be the kind of critical friend to the public process that properly belongs in a political arena, without getting subscribed to one or other political parties' particular answers to those things. I think we need to, as churches, as parts of the civil society, stand as a critical friend to seek to raise the issues that perhaps can easily get forgotten when there's almost like a policy product to be sold.
Marcia, would you like to answer Robbie's question about the effects, both short-term and long-term, on the apology and the role of business in this question?
I don't want to talk about the individual impacts on the survivors of the policies relating to removal of children, because I think we have, history will tell us what they are. But I do believe that there ought to be the right kinds of programs to track the health of the survivors and the transgenerational impacts of their experience on their children and their grandchildren. And as I say, time will tell. But I do think that, all of us feel in some way that the apology has removed a stain from our sense of citizenship. Even I can feel that, because while it didn't happen to me, although I did spend a short period in an orphanage when my mother was sick, I have many friends who are the survivors of those policies, and I just, I feel better for them that, the country is at last treating them as full human beings who, as human beings, have the right not to be treated in that way. And it being the case, there was an apology. There ought to be more. There ought to be reparation, in my view. But what's the role of corporates? Well, I think that BP sign up there, just down the street, there's a BP sign. It says, BP's Opal is, helping to stop petrol sniffing. Well, I just love it, because as you're coming down St Kilda Road and you can see that sign, I think, yeah, that's a reminder to this very wealthy community that there are petrol sniffers in Aboriginal communities, and until you've seen them with your own eyes, you can't believe the problem. They're like ghosts, in the night, and they live in the interstices, they live in the darkness, they don't live in normal society, and once they get a hold of children, you never get your children back. You just, you watch the children being taken away by the petrol sniffing gangs, and it's a horrible thing to watch. Or, I've picked them up on the streets in Alice Springs, shaking uncontrollably because they have brain damage. You take them to hospital, back then nobody would do anything for them. At least now there's a consciousness. So I think that kind of, that gesture, the rolling Opal out into communities, the role that BP's played, having that sign up there, that all plays a role in making people understand how dire these health problems are. It's all very well to say, oh, there are many wonderful, you know, functional Aboriginal communities and wonderful Aboriginal people. Yeah, you know, I grew up in a humpy with a dirt floor and I have a PhD and I'm a professor at the University of Melbourne. You know, it's been my goal all my life to show that, you know, I'm not ever going to accept the expectations of the people who persecuted my parents. I won't accept them. And but that doesn't mean to say that there aren't thousands of Aboriginal people who are suffering. Yeah, thousands. And that is why we need statistics, that's why we need measurement, that's why we need national goals, and that's why we need accountability, because there are thousands of Aboriginal people who are extremely ill. And, you know, I just don't accept all of this. I hear what Women for WIC are saying, I hear what the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association are saying, but you have to live up close and personal to this suffering to understand that we have to stop making excuses. Too many people accept this dreadful suffering as if it were normal, even Aboriginal people. And this is the problem with Aboriginal men. They accept as normal. They are inured to these conditions and they think it's normal to be sick, to be drunk, to be unemployed. So that, you know, everybody, black and white alike, thinks that that's the way it ought to be, and that's why racists say, well, you know, look at them, that's what they're like. So we're all victims of this combination of racism and acceptance of what is fundamentally wrong.
Thank you. Claire, did you have any comments?
Well, I think the questions have been dealt with, but I'd just like to make, and probably I don't know whether you as an audience will find this acceptable, but one of the things that I found in government was that governments can do so much, and Marcia's critical of what governments haven't done over the past. But one of the things that I found in dealing with communities was the impact of the last 30 years, particularly of disempowerment. And I'll give you an example. I sat with the council of one of probably the Territory's most well-educated communities, and the council said to Cabinet, how do we get our kids to school? We can't get them to school. And this is a community of about 400 people. And I said, well, you know, like parents have to do the bit, you know, we've all got kids and we all have to get the kids to school. And they simply said, we can't. And that disempowerment from strong women really hit home to me that what we have, and one of the biggest problems in our communities, is that sense that the community itself is not in a position to take action. And you can say to governments, do more, do more, do more, but unless we really start seeing, and it's what Noel Pearson and Marcia talk about, that sense of taking steps themselves, we won't get the change. And, you know, I've said it to communities, you've also got to step forward. Governments have to do more, but communities also have to step forward. And when there's unacceptable behaviour, when there is child abuse, it's no good closing down and saying, we're not going to talk to police, we're not going to report what's happening, because that is a significant part of the problem. That unless communities feel empowered to make those stands, to report people who are committing crimes, government can pour police into communities. And it's interesting because the federal government during the intervention said initially they were going to have sexual health checks of all children in the Northern Territory. They realised that was actually illegal, so it became a health check. Of 8,000 children who did get a health check, 38 were referred to the Family and Child Services, and mostly for things that didn't have to do with sexual abuse. So everything that was focused on, we will uncover sexual abuse, even the intensity of those federal government health checks didn't find it either.
Oh,
So
I have to say, I have to say that, you know, that is.
But what I'm saying,
Marcia,
but I'm saying that
see,
it is
again,
difficult.
we have this denial that this problem exists.
No, not a denial at all.
It is very difficult to uncover. It is extraordinarily difficult to uncover. And you know, again, we have this denialism. You know, people like Nanette Rogers are not wrong.
And I'm not saying they're wrong, but I'm saying that unless Aboriginal communities themselves, Aboriginal people, are prepared to say, I mean, an example, one community where there were reported cases, the police interviewed 300 people and could get no one to step forward. That makes it really tough. And so what is at the heart of this, if we are going to see change, is Aboriginal people themselves, and there's a whole complexity of issue about why they're not stepping forward. But unless they step forward, it is not going to change. Unless we see Aboriginal parents feel that education is so significant for their kids that you do get them out of bed in the morning and there's whole issues there, we're not going to see that change as well. And that's something that you find from government.
Sorry, Claire, I'm going to have to leap in because we make a point of always finishing on time.
Oh, okay.
And very sadly, it means that we don't have any time for more questions. This is obviously a topic that has great interest, and we really thank you for that. I'd like to invite Archbishop Philip Freier to perhaps summarise our discussion before we conclude.
Thanks, Penny. Well, I think you've heard some of the energy that is involved in what is a very serious issue for Australian society, and I think you can see that even with energy and commitment, there are differences of perspective. So I'm very grateful for Claire and Marcia for being here this morning to share their perspectives and share their passion. And I'm grateful for the way in which you've engaged. I'm sorry, there's probably some people going away frustrated they didn't have a chance to interact with their questions, but this is a very important topic. And I think that from when we first discussed the intervention last year, we had Professor Ian Anderson here talking about some of the health indicators, that there's been a high level of interest here amongst those who attend our conversations. So I'm grateful for the way we've had a chance to explore it in depth, to hear from Claire as someone who is in the middle of the political process, and hear from Marcia, who has made her whole lifelong commitment to this cause and the way Aboriginal people can claim their, as I think you said, their citizenship rights in this country, and the dignity that is due to all people who, from a Christian perspective, are created in God's image. And from my point of view, the tragedy of these events is, of course, that we see this marring of God's image. We see a diminishment of people expressing the wonderful richness of giftedness that they have. And as I think I've said at other occasions of these conversations, that even if we only looked at the Aboriginal youth of Australia as an economic resource, we would seem incredibly wasteful of their abilities and talents to let people be lost to some of the harmful things we've heard about, not to be having an education and making their contribution. But of course we need to be looking at them in a far deeper way and a far more comprehensive way. So on behalf of us all, thank you very much, Marcia, and thank you, Claire.
Please join me in thanking our three conversationalists. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Claire.